of someone who knows what comes next and is willing to wait for the right moment to begin it. The table had moved on. Daniel had moved on. The room had moved on. Sarah sat inside the moving on and thought about what she was going to build. She sat in the specific interior stillness of someone who has just made a decision that will require years of work and who is, in the first moments after making it, simply absorbing the fact of having made it before beginning the work of doing it. The table was talking about something that had nothing to do with her. Daniel was talking about the Meridian account, which was a large commercial project that was genuinely interesting and that he was genuinely animated about. And the people around him were engaged with the animation in the specific way of people who are enjoying the company of someone who is interesting and engaged. He was interesting when he was engaged with work he cared about. She had always known this about him and had always found it, across 10 years of knowing him, genuinely appealing. The specific intelligence that animated his face when he was talking about design, the precision with which he could describe a spatial problem, and the range of approaches available for addressing it. He was good at what he did. She had never doubted this. What she had not fully understood before the Carrington Hotel evening was the specific way in which his confidence in his own capabilities had organized his understanding of her capabilities around itself, had understood her as someone whose talent was an expression of the specific relationship between her eye and his platform, rather than as someone whose talent was its own thing that existed before his platform and would exist after it. The laugh had clarified this, not through malice. She did not believe the laugh was malicious, had never believed the specifically damaging things people did to those closest to them were generally the product of malice. The laugh was the product of genuine belief. He had genuinely believed the thing he said. He had believed it with a kind of ease that belongs to beliefs that have never been tested because the conditions that would test them had never been allowed to arise. She had not allowed the conditions to arise. She had been, across 10 years, someone who organized her professional existence inside his firm, inside his professional identity, inside the specific arrangement that placed his platform as the condition under which her capability operated. She had done this because it had seemed, for many of those years, to be the arrangement that made the most practical sense. One of them had the established platform, and the other had the capability, and the combination was efficient and productive, and she had believed for years that the efficiency and productivity of the combination were sufficient evidence of its rightness. The laugh had revised this understanding, not because the laugh had revealed something new, but because the laugh had made visible something she had known without quite knowing. The specific way that the arrangement had always understood her capability as a function of the arrangement rather than as an independent thing that the arrangement had merely been lucky enough to contain. She had been sitting with this knowledge for some time. She understood in the moments after the laugh, without having fully assembled it. The laugh had assembled it. She sat at the table for another 2 hours and ate dinner and participated in the conversation with the specific courtesy of someone who is managing the interior process of a significant decision while continuing to be present in the exterior environment of a professional event. And she was good at this management because she had spent years being good at the management of interior process in exterior environments that required the interior to be invisible. She was done with the management. She was going to do something else. She thought about her clients. She thought about the 3 who had called her directly. She thought about the portfolio and the documentation and the 8 years of work that was traceable to her in the specific way that design work was traceable when you had kept careful records of who had originated every decision. She thought about what came next. The table moved on. Daniel moved on. The room moved on. Inside the moving on, Sarah was building the first frame of the next thing. Cliffhanger. But before she could build anything, she had to survive the 11 months that followed. And what she discovered she was capable of is something none of us saw coming. She had met Daniel when she was 24, newly graduated from the design program at the city's architectural school, carrying a portfolio she was proud of and an ambition she was still learning the dimensions of. He had been 36, already established, already the kind of person whose name opened conversations rather than joined them. She had been working as a junior designer at a firm that had done work for one of his properties, and he had noticed her, had noticed the specific quality of her attention to a project, had said something about it that was precise enough to be meaningful rather than merely complimentary. And she had been struck by the precision, because precision about design was the language she understood most fluently, and very few people spoke it correctly. They had been together within a year, married 2 years after that. She had joined his firm, had been welcomed into it with the genuine enthusiasm of a partner who believed she was talented and who also believed in the specific way of people who have never been required to examine the belief that her talent existed in a dependent relationship with the opportunity he was providing for it. He had told her she had a good eye. He had meant it. He had also meant, in the way of people who do not fully examine the implications of what they mean, that her good was an asset of the firm and of the marriage and of the specific relationship between her talent and his platform that constituted the professional arrangement they had built together. He had not examined whether the good I would continue to be good independent of the platform. He had not needed to examine it because the arrangement had never been tested by any attempt to separate the two. She had not attempted to separate them. She had not attempted it because she had been, across 10 years of marriage and 8 years inside his firm, doing the specific work of someone who has never been given adequate reason to understand the full dimensions of what she was capable of independently. She had produced excellent work for Ashwood and Partners. She had been credited for it in the internal record and occasionally in the public one. She had built relationships with clients that were genuine and specific, and that were, she understood now, with the particular clarity of the ballroom, relationships with her rather than with the firm's letterhead. She had been building something for 10 years without knowing that she was building it. The ballroom evening had been the specific moment when she understood what she had been building and why it mattered that she had built it and what she was going to do with it now. She sat in the car on the way home from the Carrington Hotel with Daniel, beside her talking about the evening's conversations and the potential account that had come up during dinner and the specific opportunity it might represent for the firm's Western expansion. And she listened to him talk with the specific quality of attention that had always been her most reliable tool, hearing what was being said and hearing what was beneath it and understanding the relationship between the two. She listened to him talk about the expansion and heard, beneath the expansion, the specific and unexamined confidence of someone who had never seriously considered the possibility that the arrangements of his professional life were anything other than the natural and appropriate expression of his talent and judgment. She listened. She thought about her clients. She thought about the 3 who had called her directly over the years when they had projects, had called her phone, not the firm's number, had asked for her specifically, had occasionally mentioned that they worked with Ashwood and Partners primarily because she was there. She thought about the portfolio she maintained separately from the firm's records, the detailed documentation of her specific contribution to each project, the client communications that bore her name, the design decisions that were hers in the specific and traceable way that design decisions were hers when she had originated them and developed them and brought them to the point where they were ready to be presented by whoever presented them at the firm. She had not maintained the portfolio strategically. She had maintained it the way she maintained all careful records because she was someone who paid careful attention to what was actually happening and believed that accurate documentation of what was actually happening was a form of safety she could not afford to be without. The documentation was about to become something else. She had not started keeping it strategically. She had started keeping it because keeping accurate records of her professional contributions was simply how she operated. The same instinct that had made her an excellent designer. The instinct of someone who paid careful attention to what was actually happening and understood that accurate documentation of what was actually happening was a form of clarity she could not afford to be without. She had documented her contributions to projects in the detailed way of someone who understood that design decisions left traces and that the traces were worth preserving. She had kept copies of the client communications that bore her name. She had maintained the specific documentation of every project phase in which her decisions were the originating decisions, in the format that her attorney would later describe as exactly what was needed. She had not known she was preparing to leave when she started keeping the documentation. She had kept it because keeping it was simply who she was. The documentation had become something else because the Carrington Hotel evening had revealed to her what it was for. She spent the weeks after the hotel evening reviewing what she had built across 8 years of careful record-keeping, and found in the review a portrait of professional capability that was both exactly what she had expected and more complete than she had fully understood it to be. The portrait was thorough. It covered every significant project she had contributed to at Ashwood and Partners. It traced the specific arc of her professional development inside the firm. The early projects, the growing complexity, the increasing scope of her direct decision-making authority, the specific trajectory of client relationships that had moved from the firm's existing connections toward relationships that were hers in the way that the documentation made visible. The portrait was, she understood looking at it, not the portrait of someone whose capability was a function of her employer's platform. It was the portrait of someone who had been building a practice inside someone else's practice for 8 years and who had the full documentation of having done so. She shared it with her attorney. Her attorney reviewed it over a weekend and called on Monday morning with the specific directness of someone who has reviewed material they know how to use. She said, "This is excellent." She said, "This is the foundation of a clean departure." She said, "Let's talk about timing. Subscribe to my channel right now if you have not yet. Every story we tell here is for you. Every word is for the woman who is still standing after everything that tried to make her sit down." She left the firm on a Tuesday in March, 11 months after the Carrington Hotel evening. She had spent 11 months doing 3 things simultaneously, with the specific discipline of someone who understands that premature announcements are the enemy of necessary preparations. She had continued doing her work at Ashwood and Partners with the totality of professionalism she had always brought to it. The clients had received the same quality of attention. The projects had moved forward on the same timelines. The specific relationships she had built over 8 years had been maintained with the same genuine care that had built them. She had done this not because she was being strategic about appearances, though being strategic about appearances was the correct approach, but because it was simply who she was, someone for whom doing excellent work was not contingent on the conditions around the work being good. She had also, in parallel with the continued excellent work, spent 11 months building the structure of what came next. She had registered a business. She had opened accounts. She had identified office space, a converted loft 3 blocks from the firm's building, deliberately close, with the specific understated confidence of someone who does not need distance to establish independence. She had spoken carefully and privately with 3 clients whose relationships she understood to be hers rather than the firm's, and had understood from those conversations, conducted over coffee and dinner in a specific private register of conversations that are professional and also more than professional. The register of people who have worked together closely enough to know each other as people rather than simply as professional contacts, that those clients would follow her. She had retained an attorney who specialized in the specific legal landscape of design professionals departing from firms, who had reviewed her partnership agreement and her portfolio documentation and her client communication history, and had told her that her position was, if correctly structured and correctly timed, extremely sound. She had structured it correctly. She had timed it correctly. And on a Tuesday in March, she had submitted her formal resignation to Daniel in his office in a language her attorney had drafted and reviewed, along with the formal notice of her intention to establish an independent practice and the documentation establishing that the client relationships she was taking with her were relationships that the legal record supported as properly portable. She had sat across from him in his office in the chair where she had sat for 8 years and had watched him read the document and had watched the specific sequence of expressions that moved across his face as he processed what the document said. There was the initial incomprehension, the brief moment when the document was in his hands and his mind had not yet assembled what it contained into a coherent picture. There was the comprehension, which arrived quickly and produced something in his jaw that he managed before it could settle into the expression it was reaching for. There was the assessment, which was swift and automatic and took the form of a rapid calculation of the practical dimensions of what he was holding. And then there was the thing beneath all of those, the thing he did not allow to the surface of his expression, but that she could see in the specific quality of the stillness that settled over him when the calculation had been completed, which was the specific stillness of someone who has just realized that their model of a situation was significantly wrong. She had given him the professional courtesy of letting him read everything before she spoke. Then she had said, "My attorney will handle the formal correspondence from this point. I wanted to deliver this in person because I thought you deserved that." He had looked at her across the desk with the expression of someone who has many available responses and has not yet selected which one to deploy. He had said, "You don't have to do this." She had said, "I know." She had stood up. She had walked out of the office and down the hall to her own office, and had spent the rest of the morning organizing the personal items she was taking with her and leaving everything that belonged to the firm in the specific state that her attorney had advised was the appropriate condition for a clean and uncontested departure. By 1 o'clock, she was in the loft with the key in her hand and the late March light coming through the high windows in the particular quality that she had chosen the space for, and the first thing she did was stand in the center of it and breathe. The loft was empty except for the light, which was the specific quality of light she had chosen the space for, north-facing, even the particular quality that made colors accurate rather than warm, that made the specific visual decisions of design visible rather than disguised. She had looked at 7 spaces before she found this one, and she had known when she stood in this one that it was right in the specific way that things were right when they were right on their own terms rather than right as accommodations to constraints. She could afford this space. She had run the numbers with the thoroughness she brought to all problems of material consequence, and the numbers had produced a financial plan that was sound if the 3 clients held, and more than sound if the practice grew at the conservative rate she had modeled. The plan had contingencies. The contingencies had contingencies. She was not someone who left the contingencies unexamined. She stood in the center of the loft in the late March light and breathed, and then she got to work. The first weeks were the weeks of building the infrastructure that she had not, inside the firm, ever been required to build. The specific administrative architecture of an independent practice, which was different from the administrative architecture she had been inside for 8 years in the way that the walls of the building were different from the structure of the building itself. She had been inside walls. She was now building the structure. She learned things she did not know she would need to learn. She was a designer, which meant she understood spatial thinking and material relationships, and the specific logic of problems that had many variables in complex interdependence. She applied this thinking to the administrative problems of the practice in the way she applied it to everything. analytically, systematically, with the patient attention of someone who understood that every complex problem had a structure and that understanding the structure was the precondition of addressing it correctly. She made mistakes of the kind that the first year of any genuinely new endeavor produced. Mistakes of process and timing and the specific gaps in knowledge that were only visible from the inside of an experience you had not had before. She noted each mistake in the specific shorthand of someone preserving information they intend to use. She corrected what could be corrected. She built from the corrections. The first client project outside the firm was a residential renovation that she had designed in 3 weeks of intensive work in the loft at a drafting table she had bought secondhand and set in front of the north-facing windows, with a specific focused absorption that design had always produced in her, and that felt in a loft without the firm's organizational infrastructure around her. Both the same and entirely different. It was the same because the capability was hers and had always been hers and was simply itself in any environment. It was different because every decision was hers in the specific and unmediated way of decisions that had no organizational layer between them and their consequences. She made a decision. The decision produced consequences. The consequences were visible in the work. She could trace from the decision to the consequence to the work in the specific direct line that was only possible when the entire path was yours. She had not been able to trace this line inside the firm. The line had always passed through other hands, through the organizational infrastructure and the firm's presentation layer, and the specific mediation of Daniel's professional identity that sat between her decisions and the public understanding of what those decisions had produced. The line was direct now. She could see it. The seeing of it was one of the most significant things the first year had given her. Cliffhanger, but here is what no one tells you about starting over. The first year nearly broke her. Not because she failed, because she discovered something about herself that changed everything. And the discovery was not comfortable. The first year was hard in the specific and unglamorous way that all first years of real things are hard, which is to say not dramatically, not with a single moment of crisis that resolves in a single moment of clarity, but continuously in the specific sequential way of someone who is building something real from the materials of what they have rather than from the materials of what they wish they had. She had the 3 clients. She had the loft. She had her portfolio. She had her attorney's guidance and the legal clarity of her departure and the knowledge, which she had arrived at through 11 months of careful preparation rather than through any single revelation of exactly what she was capable of and what she was building toward. What she did not have was the specific infrastructure of an established firm, the administrative support and the vendor relationships and the established billing systems and the web of operational logistics that had constituted the invisible architecture of the professional environment she had been working inside for 8 years. She built all of it from nothing across the first year with the methodical patience of someone who understands that the foundation must be correct before the structure above it can be sound. She learned things she had not known she did not know, the specific administrative dimensions of running a practice rather than practicing within a firm, the financial management of an independent operation, the particular skill set of client development that was different from client maintenance in ways she had to teach herself in real time. She made mistakes. Some of them were costly in the way of things that cost time and money and the specific emotional energy of someone who has committed fully to a direction and encounters the inevitable friction of doing something genuinely new. She absorbed the mistakes with the equanimity of someone who has decided that mistakes are information and information is the instrument of the next correct decision. And she made the next correct decisions as they became available. And the practice began to grow in the specific way that practices grow when they are built on real relationships and genuine capability. Gradually, and then with a momentum that surprised her when she finally took the full measure of it. The 3 clients became 5. The 5 became 9. A project that had been referred to her by a client whose firm she had worked with years before became the kind of project that produced the kind of attention that good projects produced: a short piece in an architecture journal, a nomination for a regional design award, the specific circulation of a name in the professional community that happened when work was genuinely worth talking about. She won the regional award. She used the platform of the award to give a presentation that she had written herself about the specific relationship between independent practice and design risk, which was both a professional argument and a quietly personal one. She gave the presentation with the composed fluency of someone who has spent 5 years building the evidence for what they are saying and who speaks from the position of that evidence rather than from the position of someone who is trying to convince anyone of anything. The presentation was well received in the specific way that things are well received when they are accurate and delivered by someone who has standing to deliver them. More projects followed, more referrals. The practice grew. In the second year, she hired her first employee, a young designer named Priya, whose portfolio she had reviewed at a career fair and whose specific combination of technical rigor and design instinct reminded her, in the particular way that things remind you of your younger self when they are genuinely good rather than merely similar, of the portfolio she had carried into her first professional conversations at 24. She hired Priya with the specific care of someone who understood that the first hire was the most consequential decision a new practice made, that the quality of the first hire set the standard for what the practice was and what it expected of the people inside it. She had been a junior designer once, inside a firm where the person above her had believed her talent was a function of the opportunity being provided rather than the other way around. She was not going to be that person for Priya. She was going to be the person who saw the capability clearly and credited it accurately and created the conditions in which it could develop on its own terms. She told Priya this in the first conversation, directly in the specific language of someone who has thought carefully about what they want to say and who says it because the alternative is leaving important things unsaid. She said, "I will tell you what is excellent, and I will tell you why it is excellent, and I will tell you what needs to be different, and I will tell you why it needs to be different, and everything I tell you will be specific, because vague feedback is a way of not taking someone's work seriously." Priya had looked at her with the expression of someone receiving something they had needed to hear and had not expected to receive this directly. She had said, "Thank you." The practice became, in the second and third years, a place where people did good work because the conditions for good work had been built carefully and maintained consistently. The conditions of clear expectations and accurate credit and the specific quality of accountability that was different from blame, accountability that understood mistakes as information and information as the instrument of the next good decision. The third year was the year Thomas arrived. Thomas was a structural engineer with 15 years of experience in the specific technical territory that Sarah's practice was beginning to reach. The territory of projects complex enough to require structural imagination as well as spatial imagination. Projects where the relationship between what a building looked like and what held it up was itself a design problem rather than a technical afterthought. She had met him through a project that required structural consultation and had understood within the first conversation that he was someone whose specific intelligence was the complement of hers in the way that genuine complements worked. Not identical, not subordinate, but the specific kind of different that made the combination produce things that neither party could produce alone. She had asked him if he wanted to join the practice. He had said, "I've been waiting to be asked something like this for 5 years." They had shaken hands. The practice became something different, larger in scope, more technically ambitious, the kind of practice that could take on the kinds of projects that the award nomination had recognized and that were, by the fourth year, the defining projects of what Sarah Ashwood Design had become. She had not gone back to her married name professionally. She had used Sarah Ashwood Design from the beginning because Ashwood was her name. She had been born a different name and had taken Daniel's name and had not taken her birth name back when she left because she was not interested in the symbolism of the reversal. She was interested in the work. She was interested in the practice. She was interested in the specific daily accumulation of decisions and projects and relationships that were building something real. And the name was whatever the name was, and the real thing was the real thing. For years in, the real thing was clear enough to speak for itself. Cliffhanger, and then came year 5. The year she walked back into the Carrington Hotel. The year Daniel Ashwood finally understood what he had laughed at. But what happened in that ballroom is not what anyone expected. He sat in his office in the 4th year and looked at the regional award nomination list for that year's ceremony and found her name on it for the 2nd time. Daniel had attended the ceremony the 1st time, had sat in the audience with the composed neutrality of someone managing the specific experience of watching a person they had publicly dismissed accomplish something publicly significant, had found the management of the experience more effortful than he had anticipated. He had told himself, leaving the first ceremony, that the award was a regional one, and that regional recognition was a different order of thing from the kind of recognition that Ashwood and Partners operated at. He had believed this because it was true, and also because believing it was useful. The second nomination, in the 4th year, was for a project he had seen photographs of in the same architecture journal that had covered the first award, a mixed-use residential development in the city's eastern corridor that had been covered not once but 3 times, with the specific sustained coverage that publications gave to work that continued to reveal new dimensions the more you examined it. He had looked at the photographs for a long time. He had looked at them with the professional attention of someone who understood the specific design decisions being made and who could trace in those decisions the particular intelligence that had made them. He had known that intelligence for 10 years. He had told a table of 200 people in the 3rd-floor ballroom of the Carrington Hotel that the intelligence existed in a dependent relationship with the opportunity he provided and that it would not survive the separation. He had been wrong. He understood this with the specific quality of understanding that arrived not all at once, but in the accumulation of evidence across 4 years of watching the practice grow and the work develop and the reputation build. In the way that a person who has made a confident and incorrect prediction comes eventually to understand the full dimensions of the incorrectness not through a single revelation, but through the steady and irrefutable accumulation of what actually happened. He had been wrong about her. He had been wrong about her in the most important way available to be wrong about a person, which was the way of fundamentally misunderstanding the nature and the origin of their capability. He had believed her capability was an expression of their relationship. It had been an expression of herself. The relationship had provided a context. She had provided everything that had made the context worth anything. He sat in his office and thought about the table at the Carrington Hotel and the laugh and the specific quality of the room moving on and Sarah sitting inside, the moving on with the composed smile of someone who had just made a significant decision. He had not known, sitting beside her in the car that night and talking about the Western expansion, that she had made the decision. He had not known, across the 11 months that followed, that she had been building what she was building while continuing to do excellent work for the firm. He had received the resignation as a surprise, which had been itself a piece of information. The surprise meant that he had not been paying the kind of attention that would have seen it coming, and the kind of attention he had not been paying was the kind that would have required him to see her as someone whose plans and capabilities existed independently of his awareness of them. He had not seen her that way. He had seen her as someone whose professional existence was organized around their relationship. He had been looking at the wrong thing for 10 years. He sat with the nomination list for a long time that afternoon. in his office at Ashwood and Partners, which had continued to be a successful and well-regarded firm across the 5 years since Sarah's departure. The departure had cost him the 3 clients she had taken with her and had cost him the specific quality of eye that she had brought to the residential and smaller commercial work that now came to the firm through his other senior designers who were good, but who were, as he had increasingly understood in the years since her departure, not what she had been. He had hired 2 people to fill what she had left, which was itself information about the specific scale of what she had occupied. The practice had continued. It was healthy. It was not what it had been. He had not told anyone it was not what it had been, because telling people that would have required him to articulate why it was not what it had been, and articulating why would have required him to say things about Sarah's contribution to the firm that he had not been ready to say in the first year and had found increasingly necessary to say in the years that followed. Internally, in the private accounting of someone who is reassessing a significant and incorrect belief about another person. He had reassessed it in stages. The first stage had come 6 months after her departure, when a client she had not taken with her, but who had known her work, had called to ask whether there was anyone at the firm who worked in the specific way that Sarah had worked, and he had found, answering the question, that the honest answer was no. The second stage had come with the first award nomination, which he had read about in the journal that had covered the project and had understood as evidence that her work was genuinely excellent independent of the firm's platform. Not because he had not believed it was excellent before, but because the independent excellence was visible in a way that the excellence inside the firm had not been. Because inside the firm, the excellence had existed in the context of everything else and outside. The firm had existed in the context of nothing except itself. The third stage had come in the 4th year when he had reviewed the portfolio of a designer who applied to fill a position at the firm and whose work, while genuinely good, had made him understand with unexpected specificity exactly what Sarah's specific contribution to the project they had done together had been, which specific decisions had been hers, which problems she had solved in the particular way she solved them, which moments in the work that he had understood as the natural expression of the project had been the specific product of her attention to them. He had reviewed this understanding in private. He had made no public announcements about it. He had told the table at a dinner in the 5th year that he had always known she was going to do something significant. This was true in the specific way that things became true in retrospect, when enough time had passed for what had actually been true to become visible. It had not been true in a way of something he had understood before she left. It had been true in a way of something the 5 years had made undeniable. Subscribe to my channel if this story is speaking to something inside you. We build this family one story at a time, and every story is for someone who needs it. The industry awards ceremony in the 5th year was held in the same Carrington Hotel in the same 3rd floor ballroom. Sarah had attended the previous 2 years as a nominee and had not won either time, and had received both non-wins with the specific equanimity of someone who understands that the award is not the work and that the work is what matters. This year, she had been nominated in 2 categories, residential development and emerging practice, and had known from the quality of the work that had been nominated alongside hers and from the conversations she had had with colleagues about the state of the field, that this year was different in the specific way that some years were different because the work was better and the timing was better, and the accumulation of the preceding 4 years was visible in the nomination in a way that it had not quite been in the previous 2. She had come with her business partner, a structural engineer named Thomas, who had joined the practice in the 3rd year and whose specific technical expertise had expanded what the practice could do in ways she had not fully anticipated when she invited him in the way that genuine collaborations always expanded what was possible in ways neither party fully anticipated at the outset. They had arrived early and had found their table and had sat with the ease of people who have been at many professional events together and who are comfortable with each other and with the environment they are in. She was wearing something she had chosen specifically, in the particular way that clothing sometimes becomes a conversation with history. A dark green structured jacket, the specific shade of the color of the firm's branding palette that she had lived inside for 8 years, and that she wore now not as an homage, but as the quiet evidence of having been somewhere, and having left on her own terms, and having arrived somewhere better. The room filled. The tables filled. She was aware, in a peripheral way, of someone who has organized their attention on the task of being present at the event rather than the task of tracking specific presences in the room. That Daniel was at a table near the far wall. She did not look directly at the table. She did not avoid looking at it either. She simply knew it was there in a way you know things are there, when they are part of the landscape you have moved through and do not need to examine in order to have accounted for. The awards began. The emerging practice category was announced second. Her name was called. She stood from the table with the specific quality of ease that belonged to someone who has been through enough to know the difference between a thing that is significant and a thing that merely feels significant, and who has learned to carry both in the same composed register. She walked to the stage. She received the award from the evening's presenter. She stood at the podium with the award in her hands, and the room of 200 people in front of her, and understood, in the full and quiet way that some understandings only arrived in moments when everything else went still, that the room was not the same room it had been 5 years ago. It was the same hotel, the same ballroom, the same third floor. The room was not the same. She was not the same. The space between those two facts was the 5 years. All of it, every day of the building and the mistakes and the corrections and the accumulated work and the clients and the loft and the late evenings and the award and everything that the award was the surface evidence of. She looked at the room. She gave her brief prepared remarks, which were specific and honest, and credited Thomas and the clients and the colleagues whose collaboration had made the work what it was. And she did not look toward Daniel's table while she was speaking. Not because she was avoiding it, but because the table was not what the moment was about. The moment was about the 5 years. The moment was about the work. The moment was about the room of 200 people who were applauding not the name on the award, but the specific body of work that the name represented, which was hers, unambiguously, entirely traceable to her decisions and her intelligence and her capability and the specific quality of her attention to the problems she had set herself the task of solving. She said thank you. She walked off the stage. The room moved on to the next category. Thomas was grinning when she got back to the table in the specific way of someone who has been waiting for a thing to happen and has watched it happen and is entirely and openly pleased. She sat down. She picked up her glass. The evening continued. The second award, the residential development category, was announced an hour later. She won that one too. Thomas had made a sound when her name was called the second time that was somewhere between a laugh and an exclamation and was entirely genuine. The specific quality of someone who has not seen something coming and receives it with open and unguarded delight. She had laughed, which was the right response to someone whose delight was that genuinely readable. She had walked back to the stage for the second time that evening, and this time she walked with the specific ease of someone who is doing something for the second time in a single evening and who has found the second time that it was simply something she was doing rather than something that required the management of its significance. She stood at the podium with the second award and looked at the room and felt the difference between this room and the room the Carrington Hotel had been 5 years ago. Not in its physical dimensions, which were the same, not in the people it contained, many of whom were the same, but in the specific quality of what the room was for her. 5 years ago, this room had been the room where she had been made small in the specific and public way that the laugh had made her small. Tonight, this room was simply the room she was in, doing the specific professional thing of accepting recognition for work that she had done and that was recognized as genuinely excellent by people whose professional assessment of design excellence she respected. She was not performing for the room. She was not proving anything to the room. She was simply in it, accepting what was being offered, being exactly where she was with the specific quality of presence that had taken 5 years to develop. The presence of someone who is not in relationship to anyone else's assessment of them in the particular anxious way of someone who needs that assessment to tell them who they are, but who is simply in the room being who they are and receiving what is being offered because it is the appropriate response to it. She gave brief remarks for the second time, different from the first, a single specific thought about the Northern District development and what the development was trying to do for the specific community it was serving, which was the thing she actually wanted to say and which had nothing to do with the award or the ceremony or anyone in the room except the project itself and the people it was for. She said it clearly and briefly. She walked off the stage. Thomas had acquired a bottle of champagne from somewhere during her second trip to the stage, which was Thomas being Thomas, and they had a glass at the table and talked about the Northern District project and whether the champagne was any good and whether they were going to need to push the timeline on the structural review by a week or if the current schedule was still workable. It was exactly the right conversation to have at exactly that moment. It was the conversation of people who had work to do tomorrow and who were celebrating what had been done without losing sight of what remained to be done, which was a specific quality of celebration that belonged to people who had built something real rather than something that could be held entirely in a single evening's recognition of it. The evening concluded. They drove home. She sat in the car and thought about nothing in particular, which was itself a form of arrival. The specific form of arrival that consisted of being able to think about nothing in particular because the particular thing that had required all the thinking for 5 years had resolved into simply being what it was, which was a practice and a body of work and a name that meant what it meant in the professional community of the city she worked in. That was all it needed to be. That was what 5 years of building had produced. Cliffhanger. She did not speak to Daniel that evening. She did not need to, but 2 days later, a call came that forced her to look at the past one final time, and what she discovered changed her understanding of everything. She did not speak to Daniel at the ceremony. She did not seek him out, and she did not encounter him, and the evening concluded without a conversation. She had not needed a conversation. The conversation had been held 5 years ago in this room, at a table not far from the table she had sat at tonight, and it had been held in one direction, and she had heard it in the full and complete way of someone who receives important information accurately regardless of how it is delivered, and she had spent 5 years building the response to it not in the language of that room, but in the language of work, which was the only language that ever mattered for the kind of thing she had. Needed to say, the response was now in the public record. It was in the project files and the award citations and the architecture journal articles and the client testimonials and the regional nominations and the practice that employed 6 people and was working on 7 active projects and had a reputation in the city's design community that was hers and Thomas's and built from nothing except what they had built it from. The response was complete. She did not need to deliver it to Daniel directly for it to be a complete response. It was complete because it was true, and it was true independent of whether he received it or understood it or was in the room when it was delivered. She drove home from the Carrington Hotel with Thomas and his wife, who had come as a guest, the 3 of them talking about the evening and the other nominees and a design decision in the emerging practice winners project that Thomas had a question about. And the city moved past the windows of the car in its ordinary nighttime way. And she sat in the back seat with the award in her lap and thought about the 5 years that the award was the surface evidence of and felt, feeling all of it, something that was not triumph. Triumph was the wrong word for something this quiet and this complete, but something in the region of rightness. The specific, simple, durable feeling of a thing being exactly right. She thought about the specific sequence of the 5 years, not the dramatic moments, not the hotel evening or the Tuesday departure or the award ceremony, but the actual sequence, which was the daily accumulation of work and decisions and relationships, and a specific discipline of building something real rather than thinking about building something real. She had made the decision in the ballroom and had spent 11 months doing two things simultaneously, continuing to do excellent work and building the infrastructure of what came next, and had left on a Tuesday and had stood in a loft and breathed and had gotten to work. She had worked for 5 years. The work had produced the practice, and the practice had produced the projects, and the projects had produced the recognition, and the recognition was the award in her lap in the backseat of the car, going home through the city's ordinary evening. But the award was not the 5 years. The award was the surface evidence of the 5 years. The 5 years were the daily decisions, and the 3 clients, and the 5, and the 9, and Priya and Thomas, and the structural specifications on Saturday mornings, and the champagne at the table after the second award, and the Northern District development that was going to be the best thing the practice had done, and all the ordinary days that are the actual substance of what had been built. She sat in the car and let the 5 years sit with her for the length of the drive home. She had earned the sitting with them. She had not allowed herself to fully feel the weight of what she had built while she was building it, because feeling the weight of what you were building while you were building, it was a distraction from the building. She allowed herself to feel it now. It was heavier than she had expected. It was good heavy, the specific weight of something real and substantial, the weight of things that were not light because they had cost something real to make. She had paid the cost. It had been worth it. She went home. She made herself a cup of tea. She sat at the desk in the spare room that she had converted to a study in the 3rd year, the desk where she had worked on many of the projects that had produced the practice and the awards in the 5 years. And she sat at the desk with the tea and the 2 awards on the surface beside her and looked at them for a long time. She was not performing this looking. She was simply looking, absorbing the specific factual reality of the objects as evidence of the thing they evidenced, receiving the evidence with the full attention it deserved. Then she put the awards on the shelf above the desk, where she kept the other things that mattered. A sketch she had made in the first week of the loft that had become the originating idea of her first independent project, a photograph from the opening of a project in the 3rd year that she was particularly proud of, a small ceramic piece that her mother had given her when she opened the practice with the specific practical lack of sentimentality of a mother who expressed love through objects that were useful and beautiful simultaneously. She put the awards on the shelf with the other things. They belonged there. She went to bed. The call came from former colleague 2 days after the ceremony, a woman named Adiz who had been a senior designer at Ashwood and Partners when Sarah was there and who had left the firm 6 months after Sarah's departure. Not in connection with Sarah's departure, but for reasons of her own that Adiz described when they had lunch together a year later, as the specific accumulation of a series of things that had always been true and that had finally, in a specific way of accumulations, reached a point where the accumulation outweighed the practical case for staying. Adiz had started her own practice. She and Sarah were friendly in a specific professional way of people who have respect for each other's work and genuine warmth from the shared experience of having been inside the same institutional environment and having both eventually left it for the same reasons, which are the reasons of people who had understood that their capabilities were larger than the space they were being given to exercise them in. Adiz called to congratulate her on the award, and they talked for 40 minutes about the work and the practice and the specific projects each of them was currently in the middle of. And at the end of the call, Adiz said, "I heard Daniel at a dinner last week. He was talking about you." She paused. Sarah waited. Adiz said, "He told the table that you had always had a good eye and that he had known from the beginning that you were going to do something significant. He said like he was proud." Sarah sat with that for a moment. She thought about the table at the Carrington Hotel 5 years ago. She thought about the laugh. She thought about the specific quality of the room moving on and the car ride home and the 11 months and the loft and the 3 clients and the 5 years that had followed. She thought about Daniel at a dinner table telling people he had always known she was going to do something significant. She found that what she felt about this was not anger and not satisfaction and not the particular pleasure of the vindicated. She felt something closer to the recognition of a pattern, the pattern of someone who had always understood talent when he saw it, and who had also consistently and without examining the consistency, understood talent as something that existed in relationship to his recognition of it rather than independent of his recognition of it. He was proud of her. He had always known she was going to be significant. Both of these things were true, and both of them were organized around him as the organizing principle, and that was the pattern. She thanked Adiz for telling her. She said she was glad the work was reaching him. She hung up and went back to the project file she had been reviewing before the call, which was a residential development in the city's northern district that was in the early planning stages, and that was going to be, she was already certain, the best thing the practice had done. She worked until 7. She made dinner. She called her mother. She went to bed. The 5 years had been the response. The 5 years had been the whole response, and it was complete. She was already working on what came after it. She thought about this in the days following the Adiz call, about the specific quality of being done with something in the way that she was done with the Carrington Hotel evening and its consequences. She had not needed Daniel to know he was wrong. She had not built the 5 years in order for Daniel to understand the 5 years. She had built the 5 years because the building was what was required and because she was someone who did what was required with a full measure of everything she had. And the building had produced the thing she had needed it to produce, the practice and the work and the specific knowledge of what she was capable of when what she was capable of was the only variable available. Daniel's understanding of this, or the lack of it, had not been a variable she had been tracking. What he thought about her had always been his thought and had never been the truth of her. He had believed she was nothing without him. This was not the truth. He had laughed in a room of 200 people. The laugh had been a kind of gift, not the kind that feels like a gift in the moment of receiving it, but the kind that reveals itself as a gift in the fullness of what it produces. The laugh had clarified. It had stripped away the specific, comfortable ambiguity of a professional arrangement that had never been required to reveal what each party was contributing to it. And it had made visible in the moment of the stripping exactly what she had been contributing and what the contribution was worth. She had seen it. She had used the seeing to build. The building was what it was. She was grateful for the laugh in the specific and complicated way of being grateful for difficult things, not grateful for the cruelty of it, not grateful for the public humiliation of it, but grateful for the clarity of it, the way that clarity arrived in moments when something true was said in a form that made looking away impossible. She had not looked away. She had looked directly and had seen clearly and had built from the seeing. That was the story. That was in the specific and durable way of things that were simply themselves, the whole story. She called her mother on the evening of the Adiz call. Her mother answered in the specific warm way of someone who picks up every call from their daughter because they have decided that every call from their daughter is worth picking up. Sarah told her about the Adiz call and what Adiz had said about Daniel at the dinner. Her mother was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Your father used to say that the people who doubt you always show up to claim credit for your success." She said it with the gentle amusement of someone quoting something they believe is true. Sarah laughed. She said, "He said something like that, yes." They talked for an hour about the Northern District project and the specific challenge of the structural integration that Thomas was working through and the way that solving that challenge was going to produce something in the building that she had not seen done before in quite the specific way she was planning to do it. Her mother listened and asked good questions and said the right things, which were the things of someone who understood the work well enough to ask questions that were genuinely about the work rather than about the experience of doing it. When the call ended, Sarah sat for a moment in the quiet of the study. The two awards were on the shelf above the desk. The Northern District project file was open on the desk. The practice was doing the things practices did in the evening after a long and full day, which was to say was being quiet and ready for tomorrow. She turned off the lamp and went to bed and slept well for the second night in a row since the ceremony, which was 2 more consecutive nights of sleeping well than she had had for most of the preceding 5 years, which was not a complaint about the 5 years, but simply an observation about what the completion of a long effort produced in the body of the person who had been making the effort. She was done. She was also just beginning. Both of these things were true simultaneously, and she understood how to carry them both because she had spent 5 years learning exactly that. How to be done with one thing and beginning the next thing without requiring the two to be separate. How to carry the completion and the beginning in the same hands that were already reaching for what came after. She sat at her desk on a Saturday afternoon 6 months after the award, with Thomas in the adjacent office reviewing structural specification for the Northern District project and a practice doing the quiet weekend work that small firms with active projects did on Saturdays when the weekday hours were insufficient for everything the work required, and thought about the specific architecture of the 5 years. Not the dramatic architecture, not the Carrington Hotel evening or the resignation or the award. The actual architecture, which was the daily accumulation of work and decisions and mistakes and corrections, and the slow building of something that became real in the way that real things became real, which was through the daily commitment to the next necessary thing regardless of whether the next necessary thing felt significant in the moment of doing it. She had made design decisions in the first year that she had not been certain were right. She had made them anyway, because the alternative to making imperfect decisions was making no decisions, and making no decisions was not available to someone who was building something. She had revised the imperfect ones when she understood what was imperfect about them, and had kept the ones that turned out to be right, and had built from both the imperfect and the right the specific understanding of her own work that only came from working, from making decisions and living in the consequences of them, and building the next decisions from the consequences of the previous ones. She had not had this inside Ashwood and Partners. She had had the excellent work, had produced it genuinely and consistently, but she had not had the specific and unmediated relationship between her decisions and their outcomes that was what the independence had given her. She had learned in 5 years of independence what her work actually was in a way she had not been able to learn inside the firm. And what she had learned was that it was more than she had known, more specifically hers, more specifically capable of producing things that were genuinely and traceable her work in the way that work was genuinely yours when you made every decision that shaped it from the first mark on the first page to the final element of the finished thing. She thought about the laugh in the Carrington Hotel and what the laugh had been made of. It had been made of a genuine belief that she was less without him, that the 10 years inside the firm, the 10 years in which he had provided the platform, and she had provided the capability, and the combination had produced work that he understood as primarily a function of the platform, had been the truth of her professional capability. He had been wrong. She had been wrong also in a different way. She had not fully known, sitting at the table in the ballroom with the laugh landing in the specific public way of something designed to land publicly, how wrong he was. She had known she was going to leave. She had not yet known what the leaving would produce. The leaving had produced this, the loft and the 6 people and the 7 projects and the award and the Northern District development and a Saturday afternoon of work beside someone who was a genuine collaborator rather than a person she worked for. It had produced the specific knowledge of what she was capable of when what she was capable of was the only variable. She gathered her materials. She went next door and sat with Thomas for an hour, going through the structural specifications with the focused attention of the work, the specific quality of presence that the work had always produced in her regardless of the circumstances around it. The work was the same. The circumstances were entirely different. The difference was the 5 years. The 5 years were hers. Subscribe to my channel. If this story found you, it found you for a reason. Every like is a woman saying, I see this. Every comment is a voice joining the circle. Every subscription is a promise that you will come back. Drop a comment below. Tell me you are here. This family is yours, and you belong in it. And if no one has told you recently that you are doing something remarkable by still being here, by still choosing to build, even after someone told you there was nothing worth building, I'm telling you now. You are. Keep going. We are all with you. She sat at her desk on the Saturday afternoon with Thomas in the adjacent office and the practice doing its quiet Saturday work and thought about what she wanted to write in the journal she had been keeping since the second year. The journal was private, not private in the sense of hidden, but private in the sense of being written for herself rather than for the various audiences that her professional work was written for. She had started it in the second year when she had realized that the specific interior processing of what was happening needed a form that was separate from the professional documentation she kept and the client communication records and the project files and all the external forms of record that the practice required. The journal was where she processed what it felt like to be doing what she was doing. The specific interior landscape of someone who had decided to build something and was building it and was encountering in the building all of the things that the building produced, including the things she had not anticipated and the things she had anticipated correctly and the things she had understood only in hindsight and the things she was still in the middle of understanding. She wanted to write on this Saturday afternoon about the 5 years as a whole. Not the sequence of events, but the shape of the thing the sequence had produced, the specific architecture of the 5 years viewed from the position of having completed them rather than from inside any individual moment of the completing. She opened the journal. She thought for a moment about where to begin. She began with the laugh. The laugh was the beginning of the 5 years in the specific sense that it was the moment when the 5 years became necessary rather than possible. The moment when the decision she had been approaching for some time resolved itself from a direction she was considering into a direction she was committed to. She had been approaching the decision for longer than the Carrington Hotel evening. She had been approaching it for 2 years before the hotel, had felt it approaching in the specific way of decisions that are forming at a level below conscious thought, forming from the accumulated material of daily experience in a way that produces the decision before the reasoning that supports it has been fully assembled. She had known something was forming. She had not named it. The laugh had named it. She wrote about the laugh, not the specific words of it, which she had stopped requiring herself to replay, but the specific quality of the laugh, the particular register in which it had been delivered, the specific thing the register communicated about the belief that produced it. The belief was, you are less than you appear to be, and I know it, and I am gentle enough in my knowledge of it not to be unkind about it, but I am confident enough in it to say in a room of 200 people because I am certain enough that it is simply the truth. The belief was wrong. She wrote that. She wrote it simply and directly in the specific language of the journal. The belief was wrong. She had known this with the first arriving of the laugh. She had known it before she had the specific evidence the 5 years had produced to demonstrate it. She had known it the way she knew design decisions were right. Not always because she could immediately articulate why they were right, but because the rightness had a specific quality that was different from the quality of the not right, and she had learned to trust the distinction. She had trusted it. She had spent 5 years proving it, not for Daniel, not for the room of 200 people, but for the Northern District project, and for Priya, and for Thomas, and for the 6 people whose professional lives were inside the practice she had built, and for the clients who had followed her, and the clients who had found her after, and for the work itself, for the specific body of work that now existed in the world because she had spent 5 years making it exist. She wrote about Priya. Priya had become, in the 3 years since she joined the practice, something that Sarah had not fully anticipated when she hired her. Not simply a talented designer who did good work, but a person whose specific combination of technical skill and design intelligence was developing in a direction that was distinctly her own, that was producing work within the practice that was recognizably Priya's in the specific way that genuinely original work was recognizable as its makers. Sarah had watched this development with the specific pleasure of someone who has created the conditions in which a thing can grow and who is watching it grow in directions she had made room for without knowing the specific directions it would take. She had told Priya last month that the next project they discussed should be led by Priya. She had said it directly and without qualification and had watched Priya receive it with the expression of someone who had not expected to receive it this soon, and who was in the specific interior conversation of someone deciding how to hold something they had worked toward but had not expected to arrive at quite yet. Priya had said, "Are you sure?" Sarah had said, "I have been watching you for 3 years. I am sure." She had meant it in the specific way that certainty about someone else's capability meant something. Not projected certainty, not the certainty of someone who wants the thing they're saying to be true, but the specific evidence-based certainty of someone who has observed a capability carefully across 3 years of close professional proximity and who understands what the observation means. She wrote about Thomas. Thomas was a structural engineer who had changed what the practice was capable of doing in ways that continued to reveal themselves in each successive project. He had joined in the 3rd year and had contributed to everything since in the specific way of genuine collaborators, not by doing his parts separately and handing it to her, but by being in the same thinking space as her, understanding the design problem as a structural problem and the structural problem as a design problem, understanding the two not as separate disciplines that needed to be coordinated, but as aspects of a single problem that required thinking about simultaneously. She had not known she was looking for this when she met Thomas. She had known she was looking for structural consultation for a specific project. She had understood something larger in the first conversation, that Thomas was someone whose way of thinking about buildings was organized around the same fundamental question that organized hers, which was the question of what a building was actually for, what it was trying to do for the people inside it and around it, what relationship it was trying to create between the physical environment it created and the human experience of being in that environment. She had understood, before the first conversation ended, that she had found a collaborator in the specific sense of someone who thought about the same problems from a complementary rather than a competing angle. She wrote about the Northern District project. The Northern District project was the most ambitious thing the practice had undertaken, a mixed-use development in a community that had been underserved by the specific kind of thoughtful, high-quality design that was understood as a luxury feature of wealthier neighborhoods, on a budget that required the practice to think differently about how design decisions were made and what made them valuable. The project was hard in the specific productive way that problems were hard when they were genuinely interesting. The hardness that produced, through sustained attention and creative pressure, solutions that would not have been reached without the hardness. She was in the middle of it. She did not know yet what the full solution was going to look like. She knew the general direction, and she trusted the direction, and she was going to find out the specific shape of the solution in the work of the next several months, which was one of the things she still found most genuinely exciting about design. The specific gap between knowing the direction and knowing the destination, and the specific quality of the journey through that gap when the direction was right and the capability was sufficient, and the problem was genuinely worth solving. She wrote for a long time at the desk. Thomas knocked on the doorway at some point and said he was going for coffee and was bringing her one, which she said yes to. He brought it. She drank it while she continued writing. Outside the windows of the loft, the city was doing its Saturday afternoon things, and she was inside, writing, which was exactly where she was supposed to be. She finished the journal entry. She set the journal aside. She picked up the Northern District project file and went next door to talk to Thomas about the structural specifications, which were what the Saturday afternoon had been for before the writing had interrupted it in the necessary, inappropriate way that the writing sometimes interrupted the work. Necessary because the writing was itself a form of the work, the specific interior work of someone who understands that the building of a practice and the building of an understanding of what the practices are not separate projects, but aspects of the same one. She sat with Thomas, and they worked through the specifications with the focused attention of two people who are in the middle of solving a hard and genuinely interesting problem together. And the afternoon continued around them in the ordinary way of Saturday afternoons that are being used well, and outside the windows of the loft, the city did its ordinary things. And inside the practice, two people did the specific work of making something real that did not yet exist, but that was becoming more real with each decision that brought it closer to the form it was going to take. She was building something. She had always been building something. The laugh had simply been the moment when she had finally understood clearly enough what she was building and why it was hers to build. She was still building it. She intended to keep building it. That was enough. That was, in fact, everything. Subscribe to my channel. If this story found you, it found you for a reason. Every like is a woman saying, "I see this." Every comment is a voice joining the circle. Every subscription is a promise that you will come back. Drop a comment below. Tell me you are here. This family is yours, and you belong in it. And if no one has told you recently that you are doing something remarkable by still being here, by still choosing to build even after someone told you there was nothing worth building, I'm telling you now. You are. Keep going. We are all with you.